Good. All right. Good morning. So thank you for being able to make it on pretty short notice. How are you guys?
Pretty good, I'd say.
I mean, I understand that it's like, especially with something like the thesis coming up, maybe it feels like you don't know exactly what the process is like, and that can be a bit anxiety-inducing. So the entire point of today is basically to give you a bit more information so that you don't need to feel particularly stressed about anything. Like, there's nothing right now that is like, oh my God, you are behind or something like that. So there's nothing that is of in any way stressful or would require any kind of panic. So I think that's the main takeaway really from my side, just to get that across, to get you a bit of information about what the spring will look like, so that you can be a bit calmer over the winter break. That is the biggest point of today. I will just briefly go over some information for how the course is taught and maybe also how I'm thinking about what kind of proposal would be good to have fairly early on in the course so that you get that sort of information. If you have any questions or if anything feels stressful or something, then of course, please let me know because that's exactly the point why we are here. Um, yeah. Is there any questions that from you that you feel like we should really get to or address anything in particular?
Hi, Patrick. Yeah. What about being able to do individual thesis? Is it possible, or does it have to be two minimum?
Okay, yeah. So the most fun question in the start. Yeah, the we will two is minimum. So individual theses are something that we support for people who are coming back in odd timings from exchange abroad or have other sort of very specific circumstances. But the baseline is that we will have groups of two for works that are a bit more quotation marks analytic and allow groups of four or in special cases six, and anything beyond that we really need to check with the supervisor for groups that are making a game together.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Yeah, Alex.
Would there be a chance to have a meeting where we could present our thesis proposals and be able to make the groups ourselves that way? We couldn't meet in any shape or form since we all have different classes right now. So as for me, I have no idea what anyone else is writing about, for example.
Okay. I mean, yes, excellent point. And so that's where this is really sort of a. I just jump into my presentation for that. But the point is that this is really like we are basically super early for this, right? That is maybe the second point to lift up with. Initially, when we started with thesis work, the process of producing a thesis proposal and making groups was something that happened inside that course, inside that semester. So there was not really a huge expectation of having anything set up beforehand. But more and more, it has happened that students had already teams, topics, games, projects that we were working on. And we wanted to support that more and more and give the possibility to also in earlier courses work on that already. So that has over time become sort of an implicit expectation that people will arrive, students will arrive to the thesis with some sort of proposal already in hand. But that doesn't mean that it is necessary, right? This is basically just one more safety net to have a little bit more time to work on something already and be a little bit ahead of what the normal schedule would be looking like. So the meeting at the start of the thesis and then figuring out with whom we want to work together on which topic would have been normal speed just a few years ago. So it's not like anybody is behind if that hasn't happened yet. But of course, on the other side, if other people are already arranging in groups, then you might feel like, oh, maybe I'm missing out on something, or the people that I want to work with have already started doing something, and then it becomes that a little bit by itself. So I understand that. Yes, I think this sort of process of working and finding other people to work with before the course start proper is it's probably a good idea to use like either a Discord channel or have an event for something where you can pitch something like that, or arrange that without me, where you get together and find all the people that don't have a topic yet and pitch that together, right? So that's what we would typically do in the pitch events that are quite similar to pitch events for games for GGC. where you would pitch it. Okay, so I'm interested in this topic, or who else is interested in this topic and who would like to work together. But that is typically has been what we would have been doing in the start of the spring. Just that last year, for example, most people already had some sort of idea what they wanted to do, or many of them already had formed groups. So it's a little bit of me trying to figure out where exactly in this process you all are, and then of course giving you the support that is adequate to that situation. Does that somehow answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. All right, so let me just share my screen here. So here we go. Right. Yes. So you can see, perfect. Yeah, that's an image of me many years ago talking about my dissertation work or like part of this in co-creative design. But the start of all of that was when I was a bachelor student in Uppsala in International Media and Communication Sciences. And I had already, in this process, basically sort of where you are now, we had been going through a course where you could develop your thesis proposal. And I had been working on a project and a proposal that was going to look at newspapers in the US, in Germany, and Sweden, and see how they report on the same event differently to see what kind of sort of domestic or different cultural logics there are on how newspapers write about these sort of topics, right? The media studies thesis work. I presented that to the peer group. I presented that to my teacher. I got green light to do that sort of study, and then everybody sort of left the room, and I was already out of the room. And I was like, turned back, went back to my teacher, and went like, hey, but you know what? Like, actually, do you think it's possible to study like raiding guilds in World of Warcraft, this video game that I'm playing? And my teacher went like, yeah, sure. I mean, Patrick, I trust you, go for it. And that was like a really important thing for me that I could do something that I wanted to and was sort of personally interested and curious about. So I think that the takeaway that I would like to see in the story is like, yes, this is one of the things that we are oftentimes, or often, of course, students focus on what is required, what are the limitations, what we need to pass. But I think one of the most important things to consider is what the thesis allows you to do, which is follow something that you're interested in. Spend some time working specifically with a question that you care about. I will get back to that point. But before that, of course, yeah, let's go and take a look at the sort of preview here. Basic information. I'll repeat that at the start of the course. I will have to repeat that anyways, just because this is sort of important. So the structure of the thesis course is that we, in the beginning, finalize or maybe write, depending on how you arrive to a course, your thesis proposal. Then we send these proposals and use them, of course, to build groups and send them to examiners and supervisors to distribute the supervisors based on the topics so that they fit. Then we have basically three writing phases. The first writing phase is the phase where you really sort of flesh out your entire proposal so that you have all of that working and set up. Then we have the 1/3 of the course seminar that sort of happens after 1/3 of the course time, where you get feedback from your peers and also have typically what is likely going to be your examiner see your developing project for the first time and has some sort of possibility to give feedback. So we have two of these seminars at 1/3 of the time, 2/3 of the time, and then the last time you see your examiners at the examination. But we have built these sort of two steps where you should be able to have a conversation with your examiner and get some feedback from them to make sure that everybody's sort of on the same page and there's no crossed wires in terms of what this work is planning to do or any sort of other misunderstandings. So you will get a bit of feedback. Of course, you will not get, yes, this is so far a passing work because it's not ready at that point, and that's not the function of that, but you will get some feedback here. So you will get the 1/3 seminar here, some feedback from peers and examiner, then writing phase number 2, where typically most of the making the game, designing, collecting the data, doing all of this happens. One more meeting with getting feedback from me and from your examiner and from your peers, and then writing it up, finishing and submitting the thesis. You need to be physically here, very basically hard requirement, or at least somebody from your group or most of your group need to be here for the beginning of the course to set up the groups and make sure that we have a functioning proposal for the 1/3, for the 2/3 seminar, and for the defense, obviously. So after the defense, when you are passed or when you are, or even have minor revisions, then you need to make these revisions, submit them again to the examiner, then upload your papers to DIVA, which is the publication portal for that, and then you can get your take out your grade. And in cases where you maybe could get major revisions, you have the possibility to resubmit them, or even potentially, depending on if that hasn't happened yet, get like a second chance for a defense before autumn. And in the very rare cases where that doesn't come together either, you would have to retake the course the next year. So this is just the broad structure for this, right? So yeah, here's your questions here. We have typically been looking at thesis work a little bit through the lens of more analytical in quotation marks and more production-focused work. This is not a framing that we like. I personally dislike this quite a bit because I think that also analytical work could be, for example, well, producing knowledge, producing policy, producing best practices, all of these kind of things. So I think that this is a bit of a biased way of looking at that. So maybe a more sensible way is your project building, making a game or not? If your project is making a game, then typically you have the possibility to have a bigger team. The normal team size would be 2 people working on a project. And if you need more for that, you can, as a sort of default for making a game, have a group of 4 people. If it needs to be even bigger, then we need to really talk this through and figure out how this could function with me and with the relevant supervisor in the situation. So one of the reasons for the group requirements is like the more basic sort of version is that otherwise we could potentially end up with too many individual theses to be able to supervise them all. The other reason, from my perspective, the more important one is that working together in teams is oftentimes the reality of how scientific work happens. So there's a lot of co-authoring and teamwork. And B, we have seen just better results from students that have been working in teams. All of the cases that had students end up in quite tricky situations or bad situations or vulnerable situations in terms of mental health and being alone and not having anybody to play balls with and sort of really needing big interventions or help to get back on track. These have all been situations where people have been writing individually. So this is also my personal experience. Like writing this half a year working in a thesis can be quite solitary. It's really important to have somebody else with you there, to have a team and to work on something together. So it just produces better results. And it's, I think, a lot more healthy. Yes, again, so these are limitations. Oh yeah, and the last point here, right? What I mean is there's no more solutions in the back of the book, right? This means that this isn't a course paper, or being by definition shouldn't be something that in the university it anyways, but you give an answer where the teacher already knows what the right answer should be or something, right? At this point, you're really making new knowledge. That also means that maybe you have a better idea on how to write this, or the recommendation for we recommend that you form your groups this way, or like use your time this way, or write your paper this way. These are recommendations, right? So you are beyond us just knowing best on how to make this sort of work. We are completely open to having conversations about you. Like these are all recommendations. The same is true for the format, for what the thesis, like the structure of how a thesis should be written or something like that. Typically, for most of these sort of structures are meant as suggestions that say, like, this is one way that works. However, if you have a good reason to depart from this, talk to us about it, then you can probably do it, right? But if you are just looking for a default that works and that will function, this is a good default. If you want to deviate from it, you can do that, but you should have a reason to do it, not just without any reason. So because that would be sort of a way to approach all of these sort of structures. It also means that for research in these sort of spaces, there's no clear answer on anything anymore of what is like necessarily the right kind of work, right? People that do this sort of work and publish scientific work in this areas disagree with each other just the same way we do everywhere else. It's basically kind of a meme to have reviewer 2 of your peer-reviewed publication that you submitted be kind of a douchebag, right? So that's sort of very, very funny academic memes, right? But the point that two people who read your work, who are both peers, who both should be knowing what they are answering, disagree on whether or not this works. The main point, or one of the big points, of course, why we want to have an insight and contact with the examiner already early on is that we can figure out if there's any kind of disagreements or if there's any sort of issues to make sure that nothing like here happens in an area where you would be vulnerable to that, or where some sort of academic the conflict or different perspectives in different subject areas is happening as a discussion during your defense, right? So that is the an attempt here, but of course, this is still true, right? At this point, you are going beyond where somebody can just easily say, okay, so this is obviously right and this is obviously wrong, and reasonable people disagree on things. So there can be a discussion, right? In different fields, different things differently. You've probably already seen that, and I've been trying to stress that sort of from early on, that in many ways, research isn't beyond the human insecurities, conflicts, and all of these sort of tribal situations and discussions. Okay, so that is just to set that up. So that means that yes, like be prepared for that a little bit and figure out and see, okay, so which like one of the best ways to addressing that is figuring out which community you want to be a part of and which group you want to speak to, and what kind of knowledge you want to make to be able to say, okay, so but in this space, this is sort of how we typically work and how this functions. So we are adapting and using that. Good. So that brings me back to this point about what about you? What do you want to know? Because the second element to this beginning of the course isn't just what is the requirements of the proposal, but also making sure that you find a topic that you want to work with. So that means really, and that leads me back to the intro story of coming back with the topic about games that I really wanted to study, right? This is a space where you can follow your own curiosity. So that means that you should also ask yourself, from my perspective, is what is it that you want to know, that you need, that you care about? Or maybe also, what do you need, right? What is important for you where you are in your life right now? This can mean self-expression, curiosity, freedom, but it can also be being strategic about writing something that helps you get a foot in the door on a particular research group, or creating something that can be used to present on a industry conference to get a leg up, to get a job in a relevant position that you're looking for later on, right? So thinking through these lenses as well on what it is that you want to do and what you want to study, both in a way making use of this freedom, but also making use of it strategically if that's what you want to do. Okay, and in terms of topics, just because that comes up as a question as well, we are, for the most part, really looking for reasons to say yes to things that you want to study. So it doesn't necessarily need to be research or design, or there's very few hard method limitations outside of if you really want to do something we just straight up can't supervise or examine. I don't know, very, very complicated mathematical stuff or like something like that. So then we would have to have a chat about that if we could maybe solve that. And overall, it doesn't need to be pure game design. As long as it has some connection to games and game design, then we will typically find a way to say yes and make it possible for you to work with that sort of topic and do that sort of research. Good. Any questions so far? Okay. So did you manage to take a look at the thesis proposal file that I uploaded or so shared with you with the announcement? Yes. Is that in line with what you expected to produce, or is there anything that is sort of strange around that? Right? It's a guideline sort of structure for that will work if you follow it, if you want to do something different. Oftentimes more humanities work doesn't follow the strict structure of collecting data or method for data collection, data analysis, doesn't necessarily separate results analysis and discussion in the same way as a social science paper would. Some research to design would maybe follow different structures as well. So that is all fine that you change the structure if you have a reason for why you're doing it, right? So that, just repeating myself here. However, the sections that I would really expect to be there or would recommend to be there is that you have something that speaks in an introduction about some sort of societal problem, design issue, something that is like an issue, a new thing that you want to figure out, an unanswered question that you want to speak to and solve in the introduction, right? It's also good in the introduction to add for whom this is a problem. So basically already to define your target group. Let me just pick up the file that I downloaded here. Where is it? Oh, wrong screen. Exactly. Can you see this one? Should be fine, yeah.
Yes.
So, perfect, thank you. Good, right? So yeah, set up in the introduction your societal problem, and then work your way in the introduction down to your research question. The research question is typically the thing that you write in the beginning, and it's also something that we would like to have very, very early on in functioning fixed language, but it's also something that we all understand will change, right? So it's in the same way, the first thing that we read to give feedback to, because we want to really know how you're thinking about this and what kind of question you're asking and which direction you're going to see if that works out. But it's also understood that oftentimes during a research project, it doesn't quite work in this waterfall structure, but there's some sort of iterative elements to that. So you will do your research project, do your interviews, do your design, and then during the process figure out that, oh, my question while I was doing this has changed a bit and actually ended up answering a different question than what I set out to answer. That is completely normal. That's completely fine. Depending on how big the departure is, you have then two options. Option number one is you write down that, oh, and doing this, my question actually changed. At this point, our research took a different path and we did this. That is one way to do it, right? Many methodologies already have this sort of printed built in. So for example, semi-structured interviews have space for changing the interview guide and also adding new elements to your analysis and your thematic analysis already that weren't there from the start. Or another way of doing this is that you go back up and edit the research question that you had from the start to make it appear as if you were looking for the right question from the beginning. Both of these things are possible and work based on how big the departure is and what kind of subject area you're in writing in. So basically, oftentimes research papers have this sort of bit of a fiction that you knew from the start what to look for, even though that might not be the case. And depending on which subject area you're writing in and how big value they put on the sort of reflexivity and sharing your method and being clear about that, you might as well vary that a little bit. That means that we want to know your research question because we really want to know how you think, but it's not set in stone. The next section will typically be either theoretical framework or previous work. So that means here you show previous literature, other things that people have been writing about that, or other games that people have been making and how they have been analyzing that if you're doing a design work. This theoretical framework should support the research question that you're asking later on and add more nuance and more details to that. And show that it's standing on the shoulders of previous researchers who have been allowing you to ask this sort of question because they've been doing the work leading up to this. After that, we discuss methodology. Typically, that means, and this is a very sort of social science setting here for me, method of data collection, method of data analysis. This is basically what I learned when I was doing social science research. For you, that can also mean, of course, method of design. How are you building something? This can be research through design as a perspective. It means also considering ethical considerations and reflections and on your position and your reflexivity and your biases in the approach. And this is something that is specifically important for the research proposal, practical considerations of whether or not this method will work out and if you will get access to, for example, the data or can really produce the sort of game that you're planning to make. So until this point is what is required in your research proposal. None of this except the research question and hopefully the introduction needs to be fully formulated language. The methods and the theory can be bullet points, that is okay. But of course, the more you have, the more we can get feedback on, the better we can see what you're doing. I also really, really would like to warn you against using AI texts or LLMs to write this text from you. I have mentioned this before, I think, but in one of the situations 2 years ago where we had nearly half, or where I nearly had a student that I was supervising just straight up fail was when he was using AI text to write the method section. And it looked like text that makes sense, that you could read it and it's like, okay, this is English, this is like proper communication, but it just didn't mean anything. It didn't internally have a functioning logic. And that meant that he hadn't written that, meant that whenever I asked him, okay, but how do you connect this method to the research question? What kind of data do you expect to get out of asking these sort of questions? How would you analyze it? How will that integrate with each other? He just couldn't answer these questions at all because he hadn't written this text. So he felt that he had an idea, but it just wasn't ever at the point that he would be able to communicate it or really think through it. So that also means that we couldn't together criticize it and figure out how we can shape it into something that will work. That took a long time and wasted a lot of time until at some point I was like, yeah, okay, I'm just gonna not look at your text anymore. Here's a text mark. Here's a marker. Write to me on your whiteboard what you want to do. And from then on, without that thing in between, we managed to, in a very short time, get to a passing paper, which that was lucky and a lot of extra work. But it's really important here that this is your own thoughts, this is your own logics of how you think these theories and methods connect, really show your thinking of, okay, so I want to ask these sort of questions, I want to use this method, I would like to get to this sort of data that makes logical sense. This is something that can happen, that can work. If you have anything more, if you have thoughts on results, analysis, preliminary discussion, right? What are things that we can take away from this more broadly? And then also, what will this probably mean for our answer for your research question? Then sure, you can add them already, but these aren't requirements for the thesis proposal. So in summary, that means that like the perfect version of a thesis proposal has a fully written, readable, human readable running text introduction that speaks to, oh, we have a chat. No, yeah, okay. So thank you as well. Happy holidays. That had a fully written introduction that explains what the issue, the design question, the societal issues that you want to address. That explains to which group you're speaking or for whom this sort of knowledge is interesting. What is the target group of your research and the knowledge that you're creating? And that also explains how your intervention can address the sort of problem on some level, right? So like a good friend of mine set this up as basically you have about 3 sentences to sketch out a societal problem on some level, and then it's time for your superhero sentence that says, and we are going to solve this, address this, do something about this in this way. It's also very important to think about the start of your thesis. Another piece of advice that I've gotten a while back from a senior researcher that I think was very useful, even though it also put a lot of pressure, is that when he was reviewing proposals for research funding, it has only happened like 2 times in his life that he changed his mind on a proposal and reverted the judgment that he made after reading the first 3 sentences. So really the very, very start of your thesis and whether or not there's a concise problem formulation and gets clear what you are addressing and what you're doing about it is super important. That doesn't mean that you need to obsess about it. You can change that later, right? In the beginning, we write our way through that, but in the end, we need to have like a nice, crisp start there. Any questions? Right, and you can basically just use this document, fill it in with your thoughts, perspectives, and use it as a sort of working document as well, right? Like another thing that I am doing is oftentimes pull relevant references, pull citations from literature that I would like to use and put them already in there and build a little bit of a mind map for my argument and really sort of work with this text. That works as well. Of course, if you want to write collectively, you can first turn it into a Google Docs and then pull it over into the format for a Word document, like all of these things, but I don't need to tell you that anymore. You know how to work collectively. Good. So then let's get back to here. Right. So, and I'll also repeat this. I mentioned that it's important to get this sort of connection and the logic of the thesis established early and get that communication to function. in order to communicate why, I used the metaphor of a three-legged chair. So here, the thesis proposal is the chair, and a functioning thesis would be like a ball that you can put on top of it because the chair functions and stands, right? And the three legs are theory, method, and access to data. So that would be for a social science perspective, but similarly, things hold true for other perspectives. These three things need to be aligned with each other. The theory and the question that it allows you to ask is a question that you need to be able to answer with the method that you've chosen to answer it with, right? If you're asking a question that is about like deep understanding of how players understand the gameplay and how they make sense of their connection with their avatar or playthrough, and then you suggest doing a questionnaire, that just doesn't work. Like a questionnaire doesn't return that sort of deep descriptive data that you would need to answer this complicated qualitative question. So these things aren't aligned. This is going to fail, right? So you need to make sure that these connect with each other. If you have a question that is like, oh, how do designers think about that? And your method is like, I want to do interviews with the designers about that. Yes, this is aligned. But then section number 3, access to data. Do we get these interviews with the relevant designers where we will openly share about their process? If not, then, well, your chair doesn't stand, right? The three legs aren't the same. They aren't aligned. They aren't supporting this. This isn't going to function. What this metaphor is meant to communicate is that in the beginning of creating a thesis proposal already, you need to think through a little bit for the future to see if this is going to work out. Because all of these three things, your theoretical framework, your method, and your access to data, need to be thought through in relation with each other. You cannot just write the theory section, then write the method section, and then like talk about like access to data and expect that nothing of this will change. They're all codependent with each other, which means that there's some moment of where this is a bit confusing, and this is a sort of change inside of the document, inside of the logic of what this paper is going to be. That is normal. That is required, right? You cannot just write the theory section, fix it, and they say, okay, now next you do the method. They are interconnected with each other. So they need to be developed and thought about at the same time, because a change in one of them will necessitate probably a change in the other, which is fine, right? But then, of course, proper development, you don't want to like drill super in depth and read everything about one method to then figure out that, okay, but you couldn't get data for that and then have to discard it. So that's why you probe and figure all of these out at the same time to see what can function. Okay, and yeah, I think that basically brings me, for the most part, to the end of this. Right, important parts. You are not in any way behind. Like the important part would be to find, yes, some sort of logic for or some sort of notions of what the issues that you want to answer, the design question that you want to work with. See if you can establish a group to work with that and write that down and have a proposal as soon as possible. Last time we ended up, because a lot of people already had proposals, basically being able to distribute them to examiners and supervisors after, I think, 1 or 2 weeks already. That would be great if you could do that again. But if not, then that is also okay, or if not for everybody, so then we'll solve that as well. Besides this situation that, of course, feels probably a bit like pressure, this is also a space for you to think about what you personally care about, what you're curious about, and what you want to do, right? I'll get back to this taking stock and asking this as a question in a second, right? Because yeah, this is a rare possibility to do the work you want to do, right? Currently, you can design a game, you can do something that doesn't need to make money right now. You don't need to sell this to an investor. You don't need to convince me or anybody else that this is something that you consider worthwhile doing. You need to make good argument. Like you can design or do here something that you personally think is worthwhile, that you care about, and see if you can take this further to do something that is leading you to a career or to work or to self-expression that is for you important in your own life, right? So basically giving you half a year and saying, okay, just do something new, cool. What that is, that's up to you. You have this sort of freedom. That's not a thing that happens a lot in life. So my recommendation is that you also think about how you want to use this freedom, because I think it's something that is quite rare. So yeah, where are you right now? Do you want to let me know a little bit? I can stop the recording here. So also maybe stop the screen share.